A hand shoved hard against a woman's back. She stumbled forward across the porch and grabbed the railing to keep from falling. A suitcase hit the boards behind her and burst open. Somewhere below the steps, a dog started barking, low and frantic, the way an old dog barks when it knows something is wrong. The door slammed. A lock turned. She stood there in the cold, one hand still on the railing, staring at the house she had lived in for 50 years. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She was 72 years old. She had $40 in her purse, one suitcase, and a dog named Barnaby who could barely climb stairs anymore. And the man who had just locked that door was her own son. She had nowhere to turn. Where does a woman go when the last door closes on her? Stay with me on this one. Now, to understand how a mother ends up locked out of her own home, you have to back up a little. Not far, just a couple of years. Eleanor had lived in that house on Cedar Street since she was 22. She and George raised 2 kids in it. One of them, a daughter, moved to Seattle and called on Sundays. The other was David. George had been gone about 18 months by then. He'd been a mechanic his whole life, a quiet man, the kind who fixed things and didn't say much about it. When he died, people in Whitfield said the same thing they always said about men like him. Nice fella, hard worker, didn't leave much behind. And that was the thing everybody believed. George Whitfield worked 50 years and left his widow a paid-off house and not much else. No pension to speak of. A checking account with a few $1,000s in it. That was George. So when David showed up after the funeral and said, "Mom, you shouldn't be handling all this alone," it sounded like love. He moved into his old bedroom. He said he'd take care of the bills, the taxes, the paperwork. Eleanor was grieving and tired, and she trusted him because you trust your children. That's just how it works. She signed what he put in front of her. Power of attorney. Then some other papers she didn't fully read. He said it was to protect her. She believed that too. Here's the thing about trust. You don't feel it getting used against you. It happens slow, a little at a time. David started selling things, George's tools first, then the truck. Eleanor asked about it once, and David got that tight look on his face and said money was tight and she should be grateful he was even there. So she stopped asking. That's what shame does to you. It makes you quiet. Then one morning a man in a nice coat knocked on the door and asked if he could measure the living room. Eleanor didn't know who he was. David did. Turned out David had taken a second mortgage on the house months before, using those papers she'd signed. He'd run through the money. And now he was selling the house out from under her to cover what he owed. The house was already sold. The papers were already filed. She was the last to know. She begged him, "You have to understand that." A 72-year-old woman stood in her own kitchen and begged her son not to do this. She said, "George and I built our whole life here." She said, "Where am I supposed to go?" And David, who she had rocked to sleep, who she had sat up with through fevers, looked at his phone and said, "You'll figure something out. You always land on your feet." That was a Tuesday. The new owners wanted the place empty by the weekend. David told her to pack a bag. One bag. He said the rest would go to storage, but there was no storage, and they both knew it. And on that Saturday morning, when she was moving too slow for him, he put his hand on her back and pushed her out onto the porch and locked the door. Now here's what you need to know about Coldwater, Montana. It's a small town, people saw. A neighbor across the street stood in her window with a coffee cup and watched the whole thing and did not come out. Because that's the other thing about a town. Everybody's got their own trouble. An old woman on a porch with a suitcase is somebody else's problem. Eleanor had lived among these people for half a century, brought them casseroles when their people died, and not one of them opened a door. She had $40, she had a dog, and she had a memory. Because 30 years back, George had bought a hunting cabin up in the Bitterroot foothills, a couple hours north and then a long way off the road. He went up there alone sometimes, a few days at a stretch, said he liked the quiet. After he died, she'd assumed it fell to David with everything else. But David had never mentioned it. Maybe he'd forgotten it existed. Maybe he didn't know. And Alina thought, standing there in the cold with nothing left, that a half-rotted cabin nobody wanted was still a roof. It was the only thing in the world that might still have her name on it, or George's, which was the same thing. She picked her suitcase up off the boards. She snapped it shut. And she looked down at Barnaby, that gray-muzzled old collie who'd stopped barking now and just stood pressed against her leg, shaking. She said, "Well, old man, looks like it's you and me." And they walked down the steps and away from the only home she'd ever known, and nobody watched them go. Getting to that cabin was its whole own kind of hard. I want you to really picture it because it matters. Alina took her $40 to the bus depot and bought one ticket north on the county line as far as it would go, which was a town called Renner, a gas station and a feed store and not much else. The driver almost wouldn't let Barnaby on. Alina looked him dead in the eye and said, "This dog goes where I go." Something in her voice made him wave them back. She spent 2 hours on that bus with the suitcase on her knees and the dog's head heavy on her foot, watching the flat country give way to timber and the timber climb up into the mountains, white already on the peaks. It was the first week of November. Everybody up there will tell you the same thing. Winter in the Bitterroot doesn't knock. It just walks in. From Renner there was no more bus. There was a county road and then a forest road, and then, if her memory of George's directions held up, a track that wasn't really a road at all. She used 11 of her last dollars on crackers, dog food, a cheap lighter, and a plastic tarp at the feed store, and the man behind the counter looked at her old wool coat and her city shoes and said, "Ma'am, you got somebody meeting you up there." She said yes, though there was no one, and they set out walking. I won't pretend it wasn't terrible. It was miles. Her hips screamed. Barnaby limped worse than she did, stopping to rest every few hundred yards, and every time he stopped she stopped, and she'd crouch down and put her forehead against his and tell him they were almost there, even though she had no idea if they were. The light started going. The temperature dropped like a stone, and then it began to snow, soft and pretty at first, which is the way it always starts before it turns mean. She got lost twice. Found the track by a lightning-split pine George had described to her 30 years ago, a detail she'd forgotten she remembered until she was standing right in front of it. She followed it up through the trees in the dark, using the lighter for a few seconds at a time to find the next blaze on the next trunk. And just when she decided she was going to die out there, that this was it, that they'd find an old woman and a dog frozen under a tree come spring, Barnaby lifted his head and let out one sharp bark and started pulling. The cabin sat in a little clearing under 6 inches of new snow, and Alina's heart just about broke because it was worse than she'd feared. Half the roof had caved in. The porch had rotted through. One wall leaned like it was tired. Snow had drifted into the collapsed side and buried it. For a moment she stood there and let herself feel the full weight of it. She had walked all this way, spent all her money to reach a ruin, but Barnaby was still pulling. He dragged her around to the far side, to a door that still hung square in its frame, and he scratched at it and whined. And when she shouldered it open, she found the one room the mountain hadn't taken yet. The back room. Sound roof. Log walls, thick and tight. A cast-iron stove sitting in the corner, cold but whole. And stacked along the wall, dry and split and waiting, more firewood than she could count. She didn't understand it right then. She was too cold and too tired to understand anything. She just knew that George had built this room to last when he'd let the rest go, and that there was wood and that she had a lighter. She crumpled up some old newspaper she found in a crate, laid the kindling the way George had taught her 40 years back, and she got a fire going. It caught. It held. The stove ticked and groaned as it warmed, and the little room started to glow. Alina sat down on the floor with her back against the warm iron and pulled Barnaby into her lap, all 40 aching pounds of him, and she felt the shaking finally leave his body. She found a dented pot and melted snow, and they both drank. She opened a can of the dog food and split it because she was too hungry to be proud, and it was the best thing she'd eaten in days. The wind howled outside and threw snow against the logs, and inside it was warm. And Alina Whitfield leaned her head back and let out a long breath she felt like she'd been holding since Saturday morning. They'd made it. Against everything, they'd made it. She stroked the old dog's ears and she thought, we're going to be all right. We have a roof and we have wood and we have each other, and that's enough, and the worst of it is finally behind us. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, she felt safe. That's when Barnaby started barking. He'd pulled himself out of her lap and crossed to the corner near the stove, and he was standing over a spot on the floor with his nose down and his hackles up, barking at the boards. Alina said, "Hush now, there's nothing there." But he wouldn't hush. He'd stopped shaking, forgotten how tired he was, and he was scratching at one particular plank like his life depended on getting under it. She'd had that dog 11 years. She knew his barks, and this wasn't fear and it wasn't the wind. This was the bark he used to give at a rabbit hole. This was found something. She got up, her knees cracking, and she knelt down beside him and pushed him back and looked. One of the floorboards sat a hair higher than the rest. When she pressed it, it rocked. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled, and it came up easier than it should have, like it had been made to come up. Under it were 3 more, all loose. And under those, sunk into a hollow dug beneath the cabin floor and wrapped in an oiled canvas tarp, was a trunk. A steel footlocker, army green, with a heavy padlock through the hasp. Alina sat back on her heels and stared at it. In 50 years of marriage, George had never once mentioned a trunk. Never mentioned digging out the floor of a cabin he'd let fall down around this one hidden room. Her hands were shaking again, and it wasn't the cold this time. There was no key. She was 72, alone, snowed in on a mountain, and she was not about to be stopped by a lock. She found George's old splitting maul leaning by the woodpile. She braced the trunk and she brought that maul down on the padlock once, twice, and on the third swing it snapped and fell away. She knelt there breathing hard. Then she lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was money. Bundles of it, banded and stacked, 20s and 50s and hundreds, wrapped in plastic against the damp. More money than she had ever seen in one place in her life. She didn't count it that night, but she'd learn later it came to $180,000. Cash. Squirreled away over decades by a mechanic everybody said didn't leave much behind. Underneath the money was a wooden cigar box, and inside it, wrapped in a handkerchief, was a medal. A 5-pointed star on a red, white, and blue ribbon. A silver star. And a citation, folded and yellowed, with George's full name on it and a date from the Korean War and words like conspicuous gallantry, and repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to carry wounded men to safety. Alina read it 3 times. In 50 years, George had never said one word about the war. Not one. She'd thought he'd been a cook or a clerk. He'd let her think that. And there at the bottom was a stack of envelopes tied with string. Dozens of them. All in George's careful mechanic's hand. And the one on top said simply, to Alina, "If you are reading this, then it happened, and I'm sorry, and I'm not." I have to stop right here for 1 second, because if you've made it this far with me, if you're sitting there feeling for this woman on that cold floor, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like Alina's are the ones I live to tell, and it genuinely helps more than you know. All right, because you need to hear what was in those letters. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely work the string loose. She opened the top letter and held it near the stove to read. "My Alina," it began. "If you found this cabin, then you found the one thing I could not tell you while I was alive, and I need you to understand why. You are the most trusting soul I ever met. It is the thing I loved most about you and the thing I feared most for you, because our David is not a trusting soul. He is a taking one. I saw it in him when he was 12 years old, and I have watched it grow, and I knew, long before you would let yourself know that when I was gone he would come for everything you had. And you would give it to him because you are his mother, and because you would rather be robbed than believe your own boy would rob you. Alina pressed her hand to her mouth. So I built you a way out that he could never touch, the letter went on. This cabin is on land I have been buying since before you knew me. 640 acres, the whole hollow. I bought it a piece at a time in cash when it was worthless from men who needed money more than dirt. It is not in the trust David made you sign because he never knew it existed. It is deeded to you alone, Alina. Only you. The papers are in the tin box beside this one. The money in here is yours too. I saved it a little at a time for 50 years so that no matter what he did, no matter how bad it got, you would never have nothing. Do you hear me? You will never have nothing. There was a tin box, just like he'd said, and inside it the deed and Alina's name typed clean across it, and a lawyer's letter, and George's will, the real one, not the one David had waved around. And down at the bottom of that first letter George had written, I know you must be cold if you are up here reading this. That is why I kept the wood dry and the stove good. Stay warm, my girl. I am still taking care of you. I always was. And Alina Whitfield put her face in her hands and wept like she had not wept at his funeral, because at his funeral she had thought he left her nothing, and the whole time, he had left her everything. But here is where it turned from grief into something with teeth, because tucked in with the deed was one more note, newer than the rest, the ink barely faded. And it said, Alina, if David ever learns this land exists, he will not stop. A timber company has been trying to buy this valley for years. He may already know its worth. Do not tell him you found this. Get to Amos Prout in Renner. He is a lawyer and he was my friend and he has copies of all of it and he knows what to do. Do it fast, fast. And Alina, sitting there warm and finally safe, understood in a cold rush that safe was not the word, because she remembered now. She remembered David 3 weeks ago, standing in the kitchen on the phone, saying to somebody, no, I haven't found the paperwork yet, but it's got to be somewhere. The old man was sitting on something up in those hills, I know it. She'd thought he meant a savings bond. He hadn't. Her son had sold her house to cover his debts, and her son was still looking for this. It had never really been about the house at all. The snow trapped her on that mountain for 9 days. 9 days she and Barnaby sat by that stove, and she read every letter George had left her, one a night, saving them like a woman rationing food. And she made a plan because George's letters had given her back something David had spent 2 years taking. They gave her back her spine. The morning the sky cleared, she heard an engine. She looked out through the gap in the logs and saw a truck grinding up the track, chains on the tires, throwing snow. David's truck. And a second vehicle behind it, a big SUV, the kind men in nice coats drive. He'd found it. Of course he'd found it. The house sale had closed. The new owners had probably mentioned the old hunting cabin on the deed history, and David had put it together and come up the mountain in the first clear whether to claim what he was sure his father had hidden. Alina's first instinct was the old one. Hide, be small, be quiet. But she looked down at George's medal sitting on the table, a man who ran into fire for strangers, and she looked at the deed with her name on it and she thought, no, not anymore. She took the deed and the will and George's letter, and she folded them into the inner pocket of her coat, over her heart. She put the medal in her fist, and she opened the door and stepped out onto the snow to meet her son. David got out of the truck grinning that grin. Mom, he called, thank God, we've been worried sick. There he was pretending even now. The man in the coat got out of the SUV, a landman, a checkbook with legs. David walked up like he was going to hug her and said, you can't stay up here, it's not safe, let's get you somewhere warm, and by the way, we should talk about Dad's property. There's some paperwork we need to sort out. Alina looked at him, and for the first time in 2 years she wasn't afraid of her boy. She said, you mean this paperwork? and she took the folded deed halfway out of her pocket, just enough for him to see her name on it, and put it back. David's grin died. The landman went still. She said, "It's deeded to me. Only me. Your father made sure of it years ago. It was never in your trust, David. It was never yours to find." And she watched the calculation run across her son's face, the same calculation she'd seen 1,000 times and refused to name, and this time she named it right out loud. "You didn't come up here for me," she said. "You came up here for this. You have never once come for me." David's voice changed then, dropped the honey, and he took a step toward her and said, "Low and ugly, Mom. You don't understand what you're holding. That land is worth millions. You can't manage it. You're an old woman living in a shack with a dying dog. Sign it over and I'll take care of you, or don't, and I'll take you to court and say you're not competent, and I will win, because who's going to believe you?" And there it was. The thing under the thing. He'd have her declared incompetent, locked away. And Barnaby, that old dog, came out the door and put himself between Alina and her son and growled from somewhere deep, and David drew his boot back to kick him. He never landed it. Alina stepped forward and caught her son by the wrist, this 72-year-old woman, and her grip stopped him cold, because there was 50 years of fixing and hauling and holding on in that hand. She said, "You will not touch my dog." And then she opened her other hand and showed him the silver star. "Do you know what this is?" she said. "It's your father's. He earned it carrying wounded men out of gunfire in a war he never once talked about, because he wasn't a bragging man, he was a doing man, and you never bothered to know who he was. You spent his tools, you spent his truck, you sold my house, and you think I don't know my own mind." She held the deed up now, full in the light. "I got to Amos Prout before the pass closed, David. I called him from the feed store in Renner. He has copies of all of it. The deed, the will, and a letter your father wrote predicting this exact morning that a court will read out loud. So go ahead. Take an old woman to court. Let's let a judge hear what kind of son does this to his mother." She'd bluffed the part about calling from the feed store. She hadn't called anyone. There'd been no time and no phone. But David didn't know that, and it didn't matter, because the truth behind the bluff was solid as the mountain, and he could see it in her face. The landman had already started backing toward his SUV, wanting no part of a fight over a deed with a widow's name on it and a lawyer holding copies. There was no deal here for him. There was only an old woman who owned everything and a son who owned nothing. David stood there in the snow, and whatever was left of the boy she'd rocked to sleep looked out at her for 1 second, and then it was gone, and only the taking was left. He said, "You'll regret this." She said, "No. I've done all my regretting. You should go now, David." And she stood there, straight-backed, Barnaby at her knee and George's medal in her fist, and she watched her son turn around and get in his truck and drive back down the mountain he'd come up to rob her. He never got out of the truck again. The landman was gone before David even reached the trees, and Alina Whitfield stood alone in the clearing in the clean, cold light, and she was not shaking, and she was not small, and she was not afraid. She looked up at the sky and she said out loud, "You old fox, you saw all of it coming." And somewhere in her chest, for the first time since the funeral, it didn't hurt. It just felt like George was standing next to her. Spring comes late to the Bitterroot, but it comes. Alina stayed the winter in that cabin. She could have walked out with $180,000 and checked into any warm hotel in the state, and nobody would have blamed her. But she didn't. She wanted the winter. She wanted the letters, one a night, until she'd read the last of them. And by the time the snow started to soften, she knew her husband better than she had in 50 years of sleeping beside him. She learned he'd been an anonymous somebody in more lives than his own. There were receipts in that trunk. He'd quietly paid a neighbor's hospital bill in 1987. He'd covered a scholarship for a kid whose father died. He'd kept the Coldwater Volunteer Fire Hall from closing one bad year and told no one, not even her. That was George. A doing man, not a bragging man. When the pass opened, she went down to Renner and found Amos Prout, who was old now himself, and who took one look at her and said, "He told me you'd come someday." And she wept again in that dusty little office, and then she got to work. She made the deed airtight. She set the money where David could never reach it. Amos told her David had already declared bankruptcy, that the house sale had barely covered his debts, that he'd gotten nothing and gone to Billings and wasn't likely to come back. Alina took that news quietly. He was still her son. She'd grieve him the rest of her life, but she would not be robbed by that grief. George had taught her that much from the grave. Now, that timber company came calling proper in the spring, waving a number with a lot of zeros for the whole hollow, and everyone figured the old widow would grab it and move to Arizona. But here's the part nobody in Coldwater saw coming, the part that had them talking at the feed store for a year. Alina Whitfield told the timber company no, all 640 acres, and she wouldn't sell them a single tree. Instead, she rebuilt the cabin, the whole thing, sound roof to new porch, hired local men to do it and paid them well and on time. And then she did the thing that made her the last person anybody expected her to become. She'd read in George's letters how much that quiet had healed him up in the hollow after the war. So she opened it up. She turned George's land into a place where widows and worn-out folks and veterans who couldn't sleep could come and stay for nothing. A few cabins scattered in the timber, quiet, warm, wood kept dry and stoves kept good, just the way George would have wanted it. She called it Whitfield Hollow. She ran it herself, an old woman in a wool coat who everybody had written off as somebody else's problem, and now people drove hours to sit on her porch and be still. The same town that watched her get pushed off a porch and did nothing, they came around. Of course they did. That neighbor with the coffee cup showed up one day with an actual casserole and couldn't meet Alina's eyes, and Alina took the dish and said thank you and meant it, because she decided a long time ago on that mountain that she was done carrying cold things around in her chest. Life was too short and too precious, and George had proved you never knew how much good a quiet person was doing. Barnaby made it to spring. I know some of you were worried about the old man, and I won't lie to you, he was slower every day. But he made it down off that mountain, and he got to lie in the sun on the new porch of the rebuilt cabin, and he got fat and warm and adored by every guest who came through, the hero dog who scratched at a floorboard and saved a woman's whole life. He lived another 2 years, good ones, and when he went in his sleep in the sun, and Alina buried him up in the hollow under the lightning-split pine, next to a flat stone where she'd one day scatter a little of George. She never did tell many people the whole story, but sometimes in the evening a guest would ask her how she came to own all this, an old woman alone. And Alina would look out at the timber going gold in the last light, and she'd think about a locked door and $40 and a long cold walk, and a dog barking at a floor, and a husband who saw it all coming and loved her enough to build her a way out he'd never live to see her find. And she'd put her hand on the porch railing, the same way she'd once held a railing to keep from falling, except now she wasn't falling. Now she was just standing on her own land that no one could ever push her off of. And she'd smile and say, "My husband left it to me. Everybody thought he didn't leave much behind. Turned out they were wrong. Turned out he left me everything.